Repeat this after me, ladies and gentlemen. Adolf Hitler was the most famous anarchist in the and most successful anarchist in the history of humanity. I'm so glad we're going to stream about it today, because today's stream is going to be about anarchism. We're going to delve into the origins of anarchism, what is anarchism, what has its influence been on the so-called left and the synthetic left, I should add as well. And we're going to get into all of that. And the reason I wanted to get into this yesterday, actually, was because yesterday there was some news. I want to show you this stuff. So I'm just going to update you briefly. We're not going to get into too much Twitter stuff. I promise that it's not a Twitter drama stream. It's just that there's some news that I can only access from Twitter that's relevant, right? So this is what happened. This is more or less what happened. All right, so this is the pretext of what we're dealing with here. And, all right. So the PCUSA, believe it or not, it was the PCUSA, set up a table at an anarchist book fair in the Bay Area, right? And this is them, you know, they're at their table, yada yada. And some anarchists came up to them and flipped their damn table. They flipped their table. And then let me show you what they did to the bus. Let me show you what they did. They flipped the table. I think the person privated their account. But like they stole all of the busts. There was some Lenin busts, some Marx busts. They jacked everything. They smashed the Lenin busts. They pretty much wrecked the whole thing and engaged in this kind of, you know, violence against some people who were just peacefully having their own table, right? So it opened up a huge discourse, which kind of awakened something in me where I was like, hey, you know what? I've been taking for granted a big fact that, like, you know, like 75% of my enemies are anarchists, and I don't even address them ever. I never even talk about anarchism or go into anarchism or the problem that is anarchism. So we need to start talking about what anarchism actually is. So I did make a thread briefly giving my thoughts on anarchism, and basically my thesis is that one of the biggest things that's held communists back in Western countries is that for some reason we're like fellow travelers with anarchists, and oh, we disagree about some stuff, but we're ultimately all leftists. And today's stream, I want to really hammer home the qualitative difference between communism and anarchism. And also talk about contemporary so-called anarchism to make it very, very clear that this is a really misguided worldview, right? I'm not going to show you any more Twitter for now, but I just want to say that another thing that sparked this was that, you know, someone in my tweet replies, in one of my tweets, basically asked me the following question. Hobbes, how could you say anarchism is fascist? Can you name any anarchist societies where a genocide occurred? And I said, that's an easy question. I can name Nazi Germany. It was an anarchist society. It clearly committed a lot of genocides. And he said, how were the Nazis anarchists? And I said, well, absolutely. Hitler was an anarchist. The Nazis are anarchists. And even neo-Nazis and today's anarchists come from the same subcultures, right? It's the same fucking thing. And this set Twitter into a shitstorm. Everybody lost their mind and got really butthurt and mad about it. And the main reason for that is actually, it's something called midwit. So a midwit is basically like a dumb fuck who like read a few Wikipedia pages and basically thinks it's intelligent that they're able to like define these distinct Wikipedia pages. Like there's a Wikipedia page for anarchism and there's a Wikipedia page for fascism, and they're two different pages, huh? They're not really capable of like thinking about the matter in anything like. They're not able to think about it below the surface or like deeper in any capacity whatsoever. So that's what I call a midwit. A midwit basically looks at what I said and they're like, Hans, how could you say Hitler was an anarchist? Anarchists don't say that. Hitler didn't call himself an anarchist. Anarchists want to abolish the state. There was still a state in Nazi Germany, Hans. And they think this is like an intelligent criticism, if only I would have thought of that, guys. If only I would have thought of that. If only I would have thought of the fact that anarchists, in terms of what they purport their ideology to mean, is very different from what it actually means in reality. If only I would have thought of the fact that saying Hitler was an anarchist was counterintuitive. Oh, wow, it's not like the whole fucking point of the tweet is to, like, actually to get you to think critically about it. I never thought of the fact that this would be counterintuitive, guys. It's not like this is a specific irony I'm trying to put out. Like that one movie, right? The 100 Days of Salo, where the actor, he's like, we fascists are the true anarchists. And then everybody who watched that film, that like Academy Award film, they're all like, oh my god, that's so deep! But when I say it, apparently it's like, yeah, you're so stupid! You know what I mean? 100 Days of Sodom or whatever, right? So anyway, I'm gonna get down to the basics and get down to business. Get to the fucking meat and potatoes, right? What is anarchism? I want to begin by telling you what anarchism is not, okay? Anarchism is not a doctrine. It's not a doctrine. It's not something invented by a thinker. It's not a set of principles and values. It's not an ideal about what society should be. That, my friends, would be idealism. That would be the most superficial acquaintance with the actual meaning of the word anarchism, because it neglects a few things, a few crucial things from a materialist perspective. One, it neglects the crucial changes in actual history that gave rise to that very stance and perspective in the first place. It neglects what that actually means in practice on a material level in relation to the state. It also neglects, most importantly and most fundamentally, and the midwits have to bear with me here because you're not very educated or literate about these things. It ignores the underlying aesthetic that actually defines anarchism. What is an aesthetic? Is an aesthetic just like a costume and a cosmetic thing? No, most dumb fucks look at the word aesthetic and they're like, oh, an aesthetic? That's like just a superficial appearance of something. No. An aesthetic is the deeper way in which we make sense of the world. Now, the reason this particular literary use of the word aesthetic has fallen out of favor is because with empiricism and a bunch of other mentally retarded trends, we've come to think that we all just share the same sense of the world, and that the only sense of the world we can have is the empirical, whatever, scientific kind, right? But there's also another sense in which you can make sense of the world, which would be broadly, understood within either a critique of ideology, let's say in an Althusserian sense. It could be in a psychoanalytic sense, like in the case of Lacan or the post-Lacanian theorists. It could also be in a religious sense of the underlying kind of religious structure, right? About, how people say, well, communism is actually Christian and yada, yada, yada. So there's a multitude of ways in which you can think about how we make sense of the world in different ways. How the world and meaning becomes coherent to us in various different ways, right? I'm not just talking about our physical senses. I'm talking about like how we find meaning in the world, which is like the most important thing for a fucking human being, right? So that's what an aesthetic is. An aesthetic is not just an appearance. It's not just a superficial costume. It's the deeper way in which we make sense of the world. That is what an aesthetic is. It means deeper sense. So when you think of the word aesthetic, I want you to think deeper sense. And it's this deeper aesthetic that actually does define what anarchism is. It's not defined by what the self-proclaimed theorists of anarchism decide anarchism should be. It is defined by the actual way in which anarchists respond to the antagonisms of the modern world, right? And how they make sense, more importantly, how they make sense of those contradictions and antagonisms. Now, that's going to sound like a whole lot of nothing, but as I continue to delve into the origins of anarchism and fill this whole thing with content, I think it's going to be made pretty clear. So the first thing I want to do to introduce you to what anarchism is, the crucial context, I should rather say, that gave rise to what is called anarchism and anarchistic thinking, is a poem. It's a poem by a guy named Percy Shelley, the poet of English Romanticism. It's a poem by Percy Shelley. And the poem is basically called, it is called The Mask of Anarchy. Percy Shelley wrote this poem, The Mask of Anarchy, in the context of the world transformed after the French Revolution. And in this poem, he basically denounces the hypocrisy of the status quo, of the monarchy and of the police and of the law and of property and all of the priests and the clerics. And he basically claims, in this poem, or he gives expression to the fact that all of these seemingly substantive forms of the state, of religiosity, everything that is holy, sacred, property, law, monarchy, all of these are masks which disguise their opposite. They are the masks of anarchy. So I'm going to read you some lines, right? And he wore a kingly crown, and in his grasp a scepter shone. On his brow this mark I saw, I am God and King and law. With a pace stately and fast, over English land he passed, trampling to the mire of blood the adoring multitude. So in this poem, Shelley is kind of talking about how something has happened, this is my interpretation at least, that this mask is increasingly being worn, and it's being used as an excuse to trample over the English people in some kind of way, right? This is the rising proletariat is occurring at this time. You've got an increasing level of social unrest, and also you're dealing with the context after the English Civil War, which is probably the most important context that I'm going to explore here to actually derive the origins of anarchism, right? And each dweller, panic-stricken, felt his heart terror-stricken, hearing the tempestuous cry of the triumph of anarchy. So he's talking about basically this force which is wearing the mask of God, king, and law, but actually represents the triumph of some kind of anarchy. Now, how could that be, right? Well, that's why it's a mask, right? For with pomp to meet his came, clothed in arms like blood and flame, the hired murderers who did his sing, Thou art God and law and king. So they sang. This is what they were singing. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but I just want to read you parts, right? Then she lay down in the street, right before the horse's feet, expecting with a patient eye murder, fraud, and anarchy, right? So these three things, God, law, and whatever, monarchy, whatever the crown, it's actually murder, fraud, and anarchy, right? He's exposing the hypocrisy, basically. He's engaging in this unity of apparently contrary associations, which is what art pretty much is, by the way. Then all cried in one accord, Thou art King and God and Lord. Anarchy, to thee we bow. Be thy name made holy now. And anarchy, the skeleton, bowed and grinned to everyone, as well as if his education had cost 10 millions to the nation. And anarchy, the ghastly birth, lay dead upon the earth, lay dead earth upon the earth, the horse of death, tameless as wind, field, and with his hooves did grind to dust the murderers throng behind. Okay, so this I encourage you to go read the whole thing. Thematically, the point of his poem, more or less, it's pretty simple, right? All of these things that have come to epitomize the legitimacy of the status quo of his time. And when was this poem written exactly? I think it was, 1832. Okay, 1832. So this is, about 40 years, maybe, let's say just half a century after the French Revolution. All of the things that have epitomized the legitimacy of the status quo of his time, actually, it's a mask disguising some kind of anarchy. Now, what is this anarchy? What is anarchy? What is the anarchy that it's talking about, right? Again, I'm not going to proceed from, we're going to talk about Godwin, and we're going to talk about Proudhon. Well, I'm going to talk about Proudhon, believe it or not, but that's not what defines what anarchism is. What defines what anarchism is is a deeper aesthetic. Again, it's a deeper way of making sense of contradictions of the era. Now, I just exposed to you the premier contradiction that would give rise to anarchism and all sorts of political sentiment and radicalism, which is this apparent contradiction between the way in which the ruling order is trying to legitimize itself and its actually existing reality. Like Shelley's saying, right? You say that you represent God and law and the crown, and that you engage in all of these criminal excesses that clearly point to us the opposite, right? Or in the words of Proudhon himself, right? Property is theft, right? Property is theft. So in the same way that property is theft, according to Proudhon, for Shelley here, the monarchical state of Britain at the time, and this is after the French Revolution, it's some kind of anarchy. It represents a type of anarchy, right? Now that we've got that clear, we're going to talk about the English Civil War a little bit, right? And I can't get too into this. I mean, I could literally go on for hours if I really want to give this its justice. But more or less, the Reformation did something interesting, right? This rejection of the church and the authority of the church pretty much had set everything, it called everything into question, right? With the Protestant Reformation, yada, yada, yada. Namely, like, okay, our way of mediating our relationship to the divine was clearly false. The Catholic Church is the Antichrist, yada, 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 right? So if that's the case, what else have we been getting wrong, more or less, right? What else have we been getting wrong? So all of a sudden, everything gets called into question. Everything. And the most important of those things that gets called into question is the state. The legitimacy of the state. All of a sudden, the state goes from something that's just kind of there, but you're not really able to think critically about in any kind of way. And I'll be like, what about the ancient Greeks? Just shut up. You don't know what you're talking about, okay? I'm not going to get into it. But more or less, you're not able to really think critically about the state. It's just something kind of there that you take for granted. It's in the background. Now, the English Civil War, with this very shocking and also religiously motivated execution of the monarchy, basically gave rise to a vacuum at the heart of the state's legitimacy. Before you had this kind of rule by tradition, and it's all very legitimate and yada, yada, yada. All of a sudden, that gets replaced by a vacuum. People rose up, killed their monarch, and now the question of what is a state is put on new grounding. What is a state? Okay? So the first definition of anarchy that I'm going to proceed with here is that of this precise vacuum. Anarchy is the vacuum of statehood in the age of European modernity or European early modernity. Anarchism is the vacuum of statehood. That is the first definition I'm going to proceed with as far as what anarchism is. It's the vacuum of statehood. Not revolution. It's not even just the power vacuum. It's this fundamental vacuum that paradoxically also comes to represent the very substance of statehood. Now, in which theorist does the vacuum of statehood, this nothingness, this emptiness, also come to epitomize the metaphysical substance of the state? It's none other than a person that you would not expect to be an anarchist, Thomas Hobbes. For Thomas Hobbes, in his understanding of what is the basis of a state, Hobbes does not say the basis of the state is the divine. It's God-given. He also doesn't say the basis of the state is some patriarchal tradition. He also doesn't say, as in the case of the classical antiquity, the basis of the state is some kind of mythology. It's this founding, poetically contrived myth that allows us to relate to whatever our being is, yada, yada, yada. For Hobbes, the basis of the state lies in this fundamental relation of all against all produced in the vacuum of state power. And he's actually getting this from the chaos that he experienced and which defined his environment, or a substantial portion of the environment of his country during his age, during the English Civil War. Okay, so in the English Civil War, the king is beheaded, right? A lot of people confuse the French Revolution for the English Civil War in terms of their significance. A lot of people think, oh, during the French Revolution, when they beheaded the king, that pretty much overturned and set and put everything on its head and question. No, that happened during the English Civil War, when they beheaded their king and queen during the English Civil War, okay? So in terms of being able to understand and define the legitimacy of the state, what we're dealing with during the English Civil War is more or less a vacuum. We're dealing with a vacuum. We can't draw from any prior traditions. We can't draw from anything that's intuitive or natural to us. Everything's been thrown in the air. Everything gets called into question. And it's like that Cartesian reduction. Descartes, he's experiencing the chaos of knowledge, right? And he says, in response to this chaos, I think, therefore I am. I can't know if everything I know about the world is given to me by a demon, so I'm going to take refuge only in the certainty that I have that I'm capable of thought, right? Now, the same thing happened during the English Civil War. I cannot take refuge in any of these different authorities that are claiming to represent the true authority, so the only thing that I can take refuge in is in the immediate substantive basis, metaphysically speaking, of what gives rise to a social relation, right? Which is, for Hobbes at least, a relationship of hostility. When one individual's interests clash with the interests of another individual, somehow a third term arises which has to give expression and has to raise itself above them if they're going to be able to coexist in any kind of way. So the essence of statehood basically becomes reduced in some kind of way to some constitutive violence between individuals, between individual substances. But notice the key word here is individual. Anarchism proceeds necessarily with a metaphysical and methodological individualism of the state. For anarchists, the state is simply some form of power over individuals. The basis, moreover, of the power of the state is also individual. Now, skipping forward some hundreds of years, right? Which other thinker do we find this kind of idea from? Who's also a big founding thinker of anarchism. By the way, we're gonna talk about this idea of founding thinkers of anarchism as well. It's Stirner. Max Stirner basically proceeds with this idea, drawing from this metaphysical revolution that begins with England during the early modernity. Right? He's basically taking that for granted. Max Stirner kind of says, all of these notions you have of a state and a society and a country and a collective and religion, these are all spooks. And why are they spooks? Why are they ghosts? Because the only measurably real things in reality are individuals. Individuals are the only substantive real things we can measure in actually reality. When you're talking about some state, or you're talking about laws, or you're talking about a country, or some higher form of collectivity, how the fuck do you measure that? Right? You can't. So all of these things basically disguise the individual interests of individuals. Only individuals are real. Now, why is it that only individuals are real? Because only individuals are immediately verifiable in our experience. I can't touch a state. I can't incarnate the state in this direct way, right? So I have to directly kind of ground that in something. Now, that's what someone like Thomas Hobbes and Max Stirner have in common. People you'd think are completely unrelated, opposite thinkers do have in common the idea that the power of the state is grounded in some atomic metaphysical substance. It's this that they both agree on, namely the substance of individuality and the antagonism individuals pose to one another constitutively by default. Is everyone following me so far? Because I'm just laying some groundwork. I'm just laying some groundwork here. So you guys are following me, right? So obviously the French Revolution casts upon Europe this newfound mask of anarchy in a way that the English Civil War didn't. Because from the period of the English Civil War up to the French Revolution, the mask was more or less well intact. The veneer of some kind of, and I said this in my speech at CPI, the veneer that the state, the legitimacy of the state, and its continuity with the older kind of patriarchal feudal forms was maintained. However, the truth of the matter is, and this is the case when you investigate it, there was a huge discontinuity sometime during early modernity and with the Protestant Reformation and 30 Years' War in particular, the European Wars of Religion. These wars and these events somehow, from within, overturned the basis of state power. And what I mean by that is that while it appeared that the forms of tradition and legitimation of the state that had been inherited from feudalism were intact, those were just disguising some kind of atheistic, cold, calculated, and abstract form of political power, some kind of utilitarian form of power. Again, a mask of anarchy, right? What was this anarchy? The anarchy in question is nothing short of modernity, and Anglo-Saxon modernity in particular. The way in which all that is solid melts into air. All that is holy becomes profane, right? This specific thing we call modernity, which also corresponds to the arrival of general commodity production, where suddenly all relations between people become reduced to this abstract and general form of the commodity. We are talking about literally the same thing. What Marx was talking about in terms of general commodity production, what Hobbes was talking about in his idea of the war of all against all, what Shelley is talking about in the Mask of Anarchy, what Descartes is talking about in the sphere of knowledge, right, or the sphere of philosophy. And they're basically all referring to the same thing. Anarchism is nothing more than the naked expression of trying to positivize this negation. Turning this negation, again, the negation that corresponds to general commodity production, the vacuum of state power that gives rise to thinkers like Hobbes, and which, corresponds to the political turmoil of Europe, best epitomized by the French Revolution. All of these things represent a negation. They represent the negation of the old feudal ancient regime order. Okay? Now, this negation becomes positivized when we say that it is actually a real object. This negation represents the truth of all reality. This negation is itself something we can make a positive object, or in a word that Kantians like to use a lot, the negation becomes reified. Something that basically poses a problem only for our thoughts and our heads, we reify that into some real thing. So that's what I mean by positivize, right? So it represents a positivization of the negation. Now, in the case of anarchism, the entire basis of anarchism, the entire point of anarchism, and we're speaking within the realm of the deeper aesthetic that actually defines it, lies very simply in the reification of the vacuum within state power that emerges after modernity. The object of anarchism is simply the nihil of statehood, the nothingness of statehood. However, only a midwit retard will say that this nothingness of statehood merely represents the absence of the state. No, this nothingness has a presence. The presence being the modernistic, secular, atheistic, whatever you want to call it, basis of state power in the modern age. What is the basis of the state in modernity? It's in a man-made, contrived constitution. It's in some kind of, it's from reason, right? Which was popular during the French Revolution. It's from some kind of artificially contrived thing that cannot draw its legitimacy from anything objective, eternal, yada, yada, yada. If you ask the fucking Aztecs, what is the basis of your state power? They're gonna give you like this grand mythology and this great poetry and this great religious whatever. And if you ask an Ottoman what is the basis of the state power, the Ottomans would call their state, their dawla, they would call it the sublime state. Meaning the state, it literally, in terms of the way we can even cognize it, passes beyond the threshold of the faculties of the understanding, as Kant would put it. It's the definition of the sublime. It has the quality of thingness to it, right? In Kantian terms. It relates to us as sublime. That's the sublime state, as the Ottomans would put it. This view of statehood, this natural, let's call it, intuitive understanding of the state disappears, as with everything else, for that matter, with the arrival of European modernity. The first point in terms of being able to draw a critique of anarchism is to basically exercise ourselves of our own anarchistic bias that we have by default. Where we say, for example, when the ancient Egyptians used to justify their statehood or understand their statehood in religious and mythological terms, this was just a disguise to obscure and mystify brute relations of unequal power between individuals. This is patently wrong. This is what we call vulgar or English materialism. No, when the Egyptians are representing their state in this way, even though it is not necessarily scientific or materialist, they are most definitely not disguising some underlying inequalities or injustices of power. They're not justifying anything. They are giving expression to the form of their being. In a mystified way, yes. But that is the form of their being. The anarchists presume that were it not for these states across history, we would just revert to some natural state. They really, Avatar James Cameron, woo, we're just animals and plants. And they kind of project this on indigenous tribes and stuff. We would return to nature and we would become net-free again. That's not true. As Hegel points out in his, it's underpinning the entire, it's implicit in Hegel's entire project. If this were true, states would not have history. Anarchist retards look at the history of humanity since, let's say, the founding of quote-unquote civilization, which is itself a problematic distinction. But let's just say, since the emergence of private property and the emergence of large-scale whatever, they look at this and they say, these are just new forms of oppression. These are just new forms of the same injustice. And these retards evince their inability to establish the most minimal connection to mankind and their dismissal of the development of spirit, the real historical development of spirit, as all the same. This is a supreme form of gaslighting. It is not all the same. There is real development across history. There is, I'm not saying this in the Whig sense of linear progress, but something is developing. These changes in history do tell us something about our humanity. Our human being, meaning the deeper reality of our humanity, is developing in real time across history. This is the Hegelian view, right? This is the Hegelian view. The anarchist retard looks at that and says, it's all the same, it's all oppression. Even if we granted you it's all oppression, why is it that oppression has a history? Why are there, moreover, this is the better part of putting it, why does there appear to be contradictions within oppression? Why is that? Might that have something to do with the constitutive contradiction that gives rise to your aesthetic, which is namely between the way a state legitimizes itself and the actual material reality of the state? What if that contradiction is not absolute? What if you're generalizing what is actually a relative contradiction of the state itself? We're going to get to that, because as soon as I relate this to fascism, it's going to be so crystal clear to you why Adolf Hitler was the most famous the most famous anarchist in the history of the world. And again, repeat this after me, ladies and gentlemen. Adolf Hitler was the most famous anarchist in the and most successful anarchist in the history of humanity. Adolf Hitler. None other than Adolf Hitler.